Mirë se erdhët në Public Square, unë jam Ditmir Bushati. Pse në botë ka kaq shumë pabarazi? Studimet tregojnë se vendeve të Ballkanit Perëndimor do t'i duhen rreth 5 deri në 6 dekada për të arritur nivelin e zhvillimit ekonomik të mesatarës të vendeve anëtare të Bashkimit Evropian. Ndërkohë që pabarazia në nivelin global duket se është zbutur si pasojë e rritjes ekonomike të Kinës gjatë dekadës fundit, periudha që kaluam fillimisht me Covidin dhe më pas me konfliktet të cilat po jetojmë, kanë pasur një ndikim negativ për sa i përket uljes së pabarazisë. Megjithatë, brenda vetë Europës, brenda Perëndimit dhe brenda shumë vendeve të cilët janë në listën e vendeve nga më të zhvilluar, pabarazit janë rritur. Cilët janë faktorët që ndikojnë në zbutjen e pabarazisë? Gjeografia, pra vendi ku ne lindim dhe jetojmë, statusi shoqëror, preardhja familjare, mundësitë që na jep jeta dhe sistemi politik dhe ekonomik në cilin ne jetojmë? Cili është ndikimi i teknologjisë në këtë proces? Ndikimi i forcave migratore? Për të gjitha këto, unë duhet flas sot në podcastin tim Public Square me një ekonomist amerikan të famshëm origjinë serbe, Branko Milanović, i cili për shumë vite ka punuar si ekonomist pranë Bankës Botërore dhe tani më është profesor në City University of New York. Dear Branko, welcome to Public Square. I would like to start our discussion by asking you a question in relation to the global inequality.
When we look at global inequality, I have to define it that in theory, it is inequality between all world citizens. Now, that seems really big, like how do we know incomes of 8 billion people? And how do we know incomes of 1 billion, which existed in the 19th century? We do that currently in the present time by using household surveys from different countries. And then, of course, we, based on the household survey, we sort of extend that to everybody in the country. These are in principle, random and unbiased surveys. For the past, of course, it's more difficult, and I will not speak about that because it depends on many more assumptions. But for the past, we have, on the other hand, fairly good data about average incomes of the countries. So we have good data about average incomes of the countries. We do not have very good data on the distribution. But as you will see in a moment, in the past, really, the average incomes of the country were really the most important determinant of global inequality. So we can be pretty confident about our numbers. So going back now directly to your question, we then can really chart three large sort of eras of global inequality since the Industrial Revolution. We start with the data from 1820. And if you look from 1820 until approximately World War I, you had throughout that period a very strong increase in global inequality. It just keeps on going up. And it keeps on going up for two reasons. The first reason, which is very important, is that West European countries, North America, and later Japan became much richer than the rest of the world. And specifically, I had in mind China and India because of the population sizes. China went even down. So that created a large difference in incomes. I mean, just to give you an intuitive explanation, if you're during the Industrial Revolution in England and you start really somewhere in the middle of the income distribution, the growth rate of England, which in those days was not very high compared to today, but it was 1%, 1.5%, would over 50-year period make you much more richer than somebody who was in India. The second reason why inequality went up during that time was what you can call the class struggles, in a sense that class structure of society was such that there were very large gaps between, I suppose, in England, between the landlords and workers. And the same was true in France even after the revolution. And the same was true in India when you had very rich Maharajas and when you had people who were the subsistence. So that's what happened in the first era. The second era is something that is actually a little bit different. inequality was at a very, very high level, global inequality. And that was the time when the three worlds were created. The first capitalist world, which was much richer. The second socialist world that was poorer, but in the middle. And then the third world of Africa, Asia, and to some extent Latin America. So their inequality was very large between the countries, but there was no increase in inequality. Then we come to the end of the 20th century, could be, depending on the date, 1990 or even 2000 or maybe even 85, and that's linked with growth of China, and then more generally Asia. So now you have a decline, and I actually insist on that because we talk all the time about the increase of inequality, indeed, increase in individual countries. But globally, because of the rise of China, which starts as being very poor, and then becomes richer, and now it's above the medium of the world income distribution, China actually is able to drive global inequality down. And these are the three eras. And when I mentioned the third era, as I said, it happens despite the fact that inequality within China, within the United States, within many European countries, including Sweden, within Russia, within India went up. But the force of growth of China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia was sufficiently strong to offset that and to actually sort of dominate that. So that's why we have a decline in global income distribution, the global income inequality.
So basically we're saying that because of the rise of China or the rise of Asia, this was, globally speaking, a positive factor in bringing down the global inequality. What is your prediction about Africa or Latin America or the so-called global South in 10, 20 or 30 years ahead?
Yes, let me just mention what was the logic of the rise of China and how it affects global inequality. It's the same as if you were to take people who are relatively poor in any given country, and these people suddenly become less and less poor, and they move towards the middle, and even some of them move towards the high levels. It would certainly reduce inequality because the people who were poor now are just really in the middle of the income distribution. That's exactly what China did on the global level.
So you are referring to the low starting point of this group of people in China?
Low starting point with lots of people and with very fast growth. So basically what China combined is something that we have never seen in history. First, to start with really very low income. Secondly, to have lots of people, because if you start with very low income, but it's a small country, it's good for you, but it's not going to make a change for the world. But China had, over 1 billion people when we started with reforms in 1978. And then it actually grew extremely fast. So it combined these three elements, which are really quite important. Now, what will happen in the future? Now, this is, of course, we will, of course, I'm sure, mention that the uncertainties of today's period. But if we leave uncertainties aside, what we can say is that China is no longer this engine of global inequality reduction that it used to be, simply because it has now gone beyond the midpoint of the global income distribution. Doesn't mean that individual people who are very poor in China, yes, if they get better off, that's good for the global inequality. But China per se is no longer the tension. So then what remains? India, which is still significantly poorer than China, and it's growing at a reasonable rate. And very importantly, and I have really to emphasize that, large African countries that have not been very successful. And when I mention, I really hate when people just say Africa like a blanket case. It's not Africa, it's actually big African countries that matter. Countries like Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, South Africa, Nigeria. So these countries are all having like 100 million people. And their growth is crucial, especially as we know, that's the only part of the world with increased population in the 21st century. So that would be really the question for the future. Will Africa be able to converge to sort of median level of income of the world, not Western Europe or Europe, median income of the level of the world, which is much lower.
Branko, let me ask you also about external shocks such as COVID or pandemics in general, the wars that are going on. There is this Russian war going on in Ukraine, the Middle East conflict. Then there is this harsh competition between US and China, the climate emergency. How all these external shocks are affecting the global inequality? What's your analysis?
Yeah, Ditmir, this is really an excellent question. You know, I have to say that I'm personally very much, first, I'm pessimistic, but secondly, it's very difficult to predict the effects of these shocks because they are really external to the system. So let me explain. COVID was certainly external to the economic system. In other words, we could not project COVID to happen. It just happened. And it had, as you know, very negative effect, for example, on many countries, including India, which had a negative growth of 10%, I think, in 2021. Then it recovered. And then maybe now we are a little bit past COVID. We are not that much concerned. We think, okay, 2024, we are sort of out of COVID, although it still does have some impacts, including on, you can actually argue on US inflation because of a very large expansion in government spending in 2020. But more importantly now are first, the war in Ukraine with the Russian attack and the war in Ukraine. Now, this is obviously hugely bad economically and obviously for lives of people in both countries. You know, Ukraine, to some accounts, lost 1/3 of the GDP. But it is so bad because of the increased price of grain and food and increased price of energy. Now, these two components, as we all know, represent a very large share of especially poorer people's spending. So their standard of living then actually gets a hit. Moreover, that war is unpredictable in its effects. So I will not go now into what could happen, but in any case, it's unpredictable, and that could lead to, of course, much worse outcomes in the world, including obviously on poverty and inequality. But then on top of that, as if it was not enough, we have now this war in the Middle East, which is totally unpredictable as well, which could lead, for example, also to the further increase in oil prices. We have seen the problem with shipping and the value chains. So that's unpredictable, and it might have, of course, again, effect on poverty and global inequality. And you mentioned climate change. That has been, of course, with us for a while, but it gets exacerbated by all these other effects. So, you know, when you put it all together, we are now, I have to say this, really, I believe it, we are now in a situation where we cannot predict anything with any degree of confidence because of the external effects that are so significant, including China, US situation. You can imagine many scenarios where things absolutely get out of control on either China, US, Ukraine, Russia, or Israel, Palestine. And then, you know, economists are not really good in figuring out whether Putin would start another war or whether Israel will continue bombing. This is not something that economists do.
We are living in a completely different reality as far as technological development is concerned. We see a kind of new revolution in this respect with artificial intelligence, but also with the digital trading platforms. And I was interested to pick up your brain a bit on the impact of technology on global inequality.
You know, let me say that that's a very good question. I thought of this recently. I have not written about that, but let me tell what is my current thinking on this. First point, technological change is not something that we have never seen. You know, you go back to Ricardo, the entire part of the entire work was really motivated by the technological change, which was introduction of machinery in production that replaces human labor. It is true that until the artificial intelligence, most of the replacement of human labor was what we could call low skill. That was a manual labor. It started with the cotton gin machine that replaced actually individuals, not fully, but made individuals much more productive by replacing some part of their work. And that continued. And we have seen also with computers, they have eliminated many jobs. We know the jobs, just to give an example, in the past when we used to travel, we would go to the travel agent. Now these travel agents do not exist anymore. We make all our, travel. So a certain type of job has disappeared. Other jobs have been created. But the artificial intelligence, people say, is different because it would replace high-skilled jobs. To give you an idea, which I think many of you and people who listen to you would know, you don't need, for many of the ordinary things, translators anymore, because Google will translate that for you quite well. You can take a Chinese text and translate it in Albanian, or you take Indian text and translate it in Albanian, and it would actually do quite a good job. And the translator is a high-skilled person, right? So it would replace that. The problem from the income distribution side is the following. If more and more jobs are taken by artificial intelligence and actually by people who are either inventor of artificial intelligence or who are capital owners of these machines, a larger chunk of total GDP would be taken by capital than it is the case now. And capital is very unequally distributed. So the argument goes, there will be a natural tendency to increase inequality within countries because of the greater importance of capital with respect compared to labor. And I think it's a good point. I am not sure what it would mean globally, but nationally, yes, there will be a larger increase in the share of capital compared to what it is today. And this is a process that has already started maybe about 20 or 30 years ago. And that actually leads towards higher inequality because capital tends to be very much concentrated, much more than labor.
Branko, how do you see a birthplace and migration as factors that are impacting the inequality?
Yeah, this is a good question. I was working on that some time ago. And now let's go back to the global inequality. When you look at a global level and say, okay, I've got people from different countries there, and you say, okay, so if you suppose you're born in Mali, the span of income compared to the world that you might expect is relatively limited. Even if you're in a top group in Mali, unless maybe you're the president, but if you're in a top group of Mali, top decile, your income would be approximately the same as the income of the second decile, which is the 20th percentile, in France. So very clearly, when you put global data, what you notice that a large part of your income is determined by the place where you live, which in the case, I think currently 96 to 97% of the world population is the place where they were born. And then you can make some, I've done it myself and then with a colleague, you can make some other adjustments and say, well, how much is due to the level of education and income of your parents. And you get about another 20%. So what remains unexplained, which is actually to some extent your own effort, luck, or whatever, is about 20 to 30%. And that was the basis of this relatively famous quote that about 50 to 60% of your income position globally, is determined by the place where you live. About 20% is determined by your parents, how rich or educated they were, and about 20-30% is determined by you. And this is, I think, an interesting finding because it shows you how big are the differences in the world and how the place of birth and the country is very important for your, future stream of income. So that was the point. And actually the link with that point of migration is simply that if countries, especially in Africa, as I mentioned before, do not converge and have higher rates of growth than European countries, we would really have an incredibly strong incentive, which you already do, to migrate. So why shouldn't you migrate from Morocco to France if you can increase your income by 5 times?
Branko, let me bring you a little bit down to the southern part of Europe. So, and let's contextualize a little bit for those who were born in Belgrade or in Tirana or in Sarajevo or Pristina or Skopje or Podgorica. And then they were all born with the hope that one day they would live like their peers in the European Union. But according to an OECD recent study, the convergence between Western Balkans and European Union, if the current level of growth is maintained, it will take up to, I don't know, more than 5 or 6 decades. So what should be done in this respect in order to speed up this convergence process within Europe?
First of all, the rates of growth of the 6 countries that you mentioned were generally, I would say, disappointing. You would really, if you really wanted to think of the real convergence, one would expect the rates of growth to be for a durable period of, I suppose, 20 years, to be around at least 5% per capita. These countries have no population growth, so basically 5% overall growth is equal to 5% per capita. That has not been really achieved. I think that Albania was achieved that in one period where actually had very high rate of growth, but the others did not achieve. And secondly, of course, these countries lost quite a lot of population, which to some extent on the per capita basis is good, because I think that actually some of the incomes are underestimated because they count more people in a country than there are. Bulgaria, I think, is a very good example. I think people argue that actually 20% of population left. So when you take the GDP of Bulgaria, you should not divide it by the census data, which assumes that these people are there. And the same may be true actually for Albania, and I think the same is true in Croatia. So maybe the per capita incomes are underestimated. Nevertheless, the issue is the convergence. And as you said, with the current levels, that convergence will take 60 years, and maybe even that's optimistic. That might take even a century. On top of that, we have to realize one thing, is that this convergence, even if it were to happen in 60 years, is a convergence to Western European levels, which are good levels, but one cannot forget that Western Europe, in the world scheme of things, as I was mentioning before, is actually on the decline. And I know that for many people that comes as a surprise, but Italy, for example, has not grown for 20 years. And if you look at the Italian position of the lower part of the Italian income distribution, they have all gone down because they've been overtaken by the Asian middle classes. So we have to understand in Southeast Europe that, of course, our objective is Western Europe, but that objective itself is worldwide declining. A nice example is Poland, which is a success case. And Poland would actually probably in a couple of years, maybe in 4 or 5 years, catch up in terms of GDP per capita Italy. That's a huge success. But on the other hand, as I said before, they are catching up a country that has not grown in 25 years.
I need to insist on this point because there is lots of debate going on in our region about depopulation. People that have lost trust in the region, and they think that it's easier to go to Germany or US or Canada rather than improving social and economic status within the society. And I know that many progressive economists and thinkers are putting the emphasis on productivity. So basically on an economic model that is based on productivity. So my question to you is, what would make a common approach, a sensible approach to organize the economies of our region based on components that would ensure first increase of individual incomes, but also population growth, which is not the case of Western Balkans.
It is true. I think definitely cooperation and ability to certainly buy and sell goods and not have administrative impediments and not have tariff rates and all of that is a plus. On the other hand, I cannot criticize, for example, many people, as you said, there was a clear depopulation. You look at all countries. You look at Albania, you look at Kosovo, you look at Serbia, you look at Croatia, I mentioned before Bulgaria, Romania. I was many years ago in Spain, and then they had a daily newspaper which was published in Bulgaria. So there was a depopulation. People just follow their interest and they go somewhere else where they are going to have more money. So, we cannot, criticize them for doing that. But we have, actually, the countries should make the conditions internally better so that fewer people leave. People just don't leave countries because they get, so many euros higher. You have to have a significant gap in incomes for people to leave because they often prefer their own language, they prefer their own cooking, their own friends. So they leave only when the gap is very large. And I am not, as I said before, I'm relatively, when I look at the past, I'm not seeing the countries in the West, so-called the Western Balkans, or the countries in the Balkans in general, to have been able to do much and to accelerate growth. Although maybe there are some areas, for example, Romania recently had a very high rates of growth, thanks to development of new technology and the movement of many people who actually work for foreign companies moving to Romania, and Romania itself, being very good in new technologies. So there may be niches, and I don't know them. There is an agricultural niche. One should not forget about that. The countries that you mentioned have fairly good climate for many products, actually. I was always told that I should try the Albanian olive oil. There are many things there. So, I'm not totally pessimistic, but I don't think that it has been used in the last 40 years.
You have been writing also about the increased participation of middle class in the assets. So not just the increase of individual incomes. Can you elaborate this a little bit also in the context of Southeast Europe, where we see that the middle class is being squeezed?
Yes, this actually goes it's relevant, and it goes almost together with the point that I made about the artificial intelligence minutes ago, that the artificial intelligence would mean that a larger part of GDP belongs to capital than it does now, simply because artificial intelligence is capital. Whoever produces artificial intelligence, that becomes capital. It is non-tangible capital, but it's capital. So then the question becomes, if that leads to an automatic transmission in higher inequality, how do we make sure or offset that, make sure that it does not happen, or offset that increase? Now the possibility is try, and there are actually some measures. More recently, Japan had a very interesting measure to broaden ownership of capital. And that meant that, for example, small investors would not be taxed on their returns. So that basically what you're trying to do, you're trying to actually, if already capital is becoming a larger share of total GDP, let's try to find a way that some of that capital is owned not by only rich people, by the middle class. And then, in the past and still now, the middle class is very reluctant to invest in capital assets because of volatility of prices. And, people don't have so much money. If you have $1 million or $2 million, you can actually invest. But if you have only a couple of $1,000, you're not going to put all of that in the stock market or some unknown stock. So that's where the government, and this is Japan's idea, the government should guarantee you that you're not going to lose that money if it's small money. And so that was the attempt to broaden it, to broaden the ownership. One of the ways of broadening the ownership was also privatization of housing, which of course happened in most of the formerly socialist countries. Now they have among the highest rates of private-owned housing, compared, I suppose, to Austria or Germany. Southeast European countries have much more private housing percentage-wise. So, there are many of these attempts that would actually try to push the middle class toward being more capitalistic.
My last question, which might not be in relation to global inequality, but for sure is, in my view, linked to the overall development of our societies and also with rule of law and life in general. In your blog, you have written last year, if I'm not mistaken, about comprador intelligentsia, where you basically somehow are putting this concept into the context of Southeast Europe. Can you share your views with us? Why there is this lack of ownership even after more than 3 decades since the fall of Berlin Wall? So is inequality somehow related also with the state of mind and ownership that we have to show for some processes and for some reforms?
It's a difficult question. I think it's linked with the state of mind, as you said, I would agree, but it's also linked with money. In other words, let me explain how I see that. I see essentially all the smaller countries. It's very difficult for the intelligentsia there, or let's call it like a social scientist. They work on certain issues, but it's very difficult to make these issues sufficiently appealing to the rest of the world because they are, honestly speaking, seen as small countries, small issues. I have to say, maybe parenthetically, but that was a difference, and that's why obviously I noticed it. And I grew up in the former Yugoslavia, where because of socialism and because of what became called Titoism, Yugoslavia had its own specificity. So that specificity attracted foreign interest. Simply that was something different. It was a socialism, but it was not Soviet socialism. It was self-management. Workers were ruling factories. So the issue was how, and attracted actually foreign interest and created domestic social science. And I could tell you the names of the people who became internationally known who worked on them. This then changed, and the funding of research nowadays, as you know, comes largely from the European Union, from the West, and they are the ones, because of their own interest, they kind of essentially give the themes that should be discussed. So these themes are not necessarily always relevant for the countries in question. So people do them because these are the international themes, they get money from that, and they continue doing it. But once the international organizations or the European Union change, they start working on one theme, but then there is something else, then that particular line of research that has been developing in the small country, recipient country, just disappears. And that shows you that there was no autochthonous interest in those countries. And it is not only specificity of the Balkans, it is very much true, even more true actually for African countries. It is true for many Latin American countries as well. They are not able to generate domestic research in sufficient quality and enough money to interest the rest of the world, and consequently do not create domestic base. And that base which exists, as I said, is really at the whim of international organizations. So that's what I meant by comprador bourgeoisie. I didn't want to be negative because I think that in many cases people have to do that. And also it is true that many institutions internationally have had a good influence in those countries. So I'm not really putting the blanket judgment. I'm just saying that some themes that are being studied really do not have an echo in the countries where they're being studied.
Thank you very much, Branko. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure, as I said, to be there. Thank you for the excellent questions, and I hope we will be able to stay in touch.
Thank you.